Yes.
Okay. So thank you everyone for joining this meeting today, and we are super excited to have you all here in yet another session of SAIMA, which is Salesforce Architects in Making. And this is the fourth session of the study group. All right, so I see the number of participants are shooting up. Every second I see that number. And I'm thankful to Johan, Gaurav, and everyone else for promoting this event on LinkedIn and other social media platforms. And welcome all once again. So my name is Neha. I'm your host for today. I have been working in Salesforce ecosystem from about 7 years now, and I'm currently employed as application development team lead at Accenture, where I got a chance to work on multi-cloud systems. And current project which I'm working on is my 10th Salesforce implementation. And so I thought, hey, this is the right time to get certified. So here I am on my architect journey. On our architect journey. So let us all together create and share content with each other so we can become good architects even before getting certified as technical architects. So enough about me. Let's meet our speakers for today. Our CTA Master Coach is Sebastian, who will be presenting 5 secret weapons of a great architect, which is a must know for all CTA aspirants. And we have Saurabh with us, who is a compliant expert and will be talking about Salesforce data privacy, GDPR, and the road to success, which is yet another crucial topic for CTA Review Board. Okay, so before we get started with this session, I would like to share our goals and what we want to achieve. We want to be able to support each other in preparing for technical architect certification by creating and sharing content that helps to prepare for the certification. And this is a small facilitation for small study groups to make room for discussion-based learning. So if you have more ideas that you would like to share, please ping us, or the chat is open for everyone to give their ideas. Some basic housekeeping rules. Please mute yourself while the presenters are presenting, and you can ask all your questions on the chat. And after the talk is over, we'll be given 10 minutes for Q&A round. And also, we are not perfect, neither do we know everything. If you spot any mistake, please do let us know in chats, of course. And if you're interested in presenting or hosting your next event, please reach out to us, and everybody is welcome since it's an open platform. So let's get started with our first session, which is Secret Weapons of Great Architects. I will hand over to Sebastian. Hey, Sebastian.
Hi, Nia. Thank you very much for having me today. And thank you very much for the introduction. Good. Can you give me co-host rights, please, in order for me to share my screen?
Yes.
Excellent.
You're all set.
Okay. Excellent. So let's get started. How's disabled attendee screen sharing? I am afraid I can't share.
Neha, you gave up. Europe became our host now.
That was not the right person, Neha.
Abi Rupp, can you make Sebastian the host? You're our host currently.
So it's constantly moving up and down.
Yeah, no problem.
I mean, I could try freestyling it, but there are some really good images and pictures on that slide that will kind of support what I have to say. Excellent. Good. So it appears like I got the power almost. Excellent. Okay, guys. So first of all, please don't wonder why this is a Dreamforce presentation. I had asked my assistant to reformat it in the Flow Republic style, but I didn't really want to give that to you because it really looks awful. So regardless of that, regardless of the fact that this is with the Dreamforce 2019 template, the content is still extremely relevant, and not only for becoming a certified technical architect, but pretty much for everybody who wants to be successful in consulting, those are really extremely helpful tools. And a lot of senior individuals kind of build those up throughout their careers. So what I've done is I've kind of picked some of the most helpful tools that I came across and put them here in a presentation together to really help you become more successful. I presume the majority of you guys knows me already because I've seen a lot of people stalking me on LinkedIn in the last couple of days. But just a quick summary. So my name is Sebastian. I'm the founder of Flow Republic and the CTA Master Coach, which kind of means I help aspiring architects on their last mile towards the certification. And I'm really happy for you to have invited me as one of my students. So thank you very much for the opportunity. And with that said, let's get into the presentation. So the first thing that I want to ask you is, what do you think makes a great architect? Just give it a second, think about it. Okay, cool. So in order to become or be a great architect, it is really about being able to take perspective. Because if you look at the cube here that you can see, the perspective will shift. You will see the backline being in the front or in, sorry, this line being in the front or in the back, depending on what moment you're looking at. And that's exactly the same thing. With architecture, it is really about perspective, being able to take different perspectives on the same topic. It's also about working with models and abstraction and being able to separate the tangible and the directly visible from the concepts that are overarching. And it's really about understanding. So the perspective, the models, and the abstraction help us to gain a better understanding of a problem and arrive at the solution that we ultimately need to communicate. And communication is an immensely important topic, and really my recommendation for everybody who is planning to become a CTA, okay, please do not spend all the time just trying to absorb all the technical knowledge, because if you're not able to put this into a comprehensive solution and communicate this solution sufficiently, you're not going to become a certified technical architect. Easy as that. Okay, so please invest time and energy, work together, give presentations, work on mock scenarios. That being said, let's look into the scenario that we're going to use, because I want to make this really tangible and easy to access for everybody. The company that we are working with here in our scenario is a company called Forbidden Fruits. I guess everybody can imagine who their company might be. They are a consumer electronic manufacturer, and their model is business to consumer as well as business to business, using sales channels of online shops as well as of resellers. And our focus for the scenario today is to implement a sales process on Salesforce. So imagine yourself, we are in a new project with this customer. How do we approach it? Yeah? What do you really need to design the ideal solution for the customer? And how do you communicate with the business and the IT department? Because after all, architecture is, as I said before, about communication. And it's not only about communicating with technical resources, but we also need to be able to communicate with the business and liaison any kind of inputs and feedback that we're getting from them to a technical audience. So let's get started with the first tool or weapon that I would like to introduce you to, which is the so-called business capability map, or the view from above. So it's really a model that describes what the business does, its capabilities, instead of how it does it. If you put yourself in a situation when you're working on a project, very often we are presented with process diagrams, with like a requirements catalog, but we're kind of lacking the overall picture and the understanding. So the business capability map is something that helps us gaining a larger view from the business perspective, taking us out from the pure technical perspective, because it's technology and system agnostic, and we can use it to gain a hint towards potential solution components. And by the way, I wouldn't necessarily expect a TA to create a business capability map, because very often that is something created by a business architect. But it can help to be able to at least define what a business capability map is and what to expect from it. And in an ideal state, of course, you can create one. So let's take here the example from forbidden fruit. We have different business domains. So the business objective, they conduct online marketing. The other objective is to sell to consumers. And what we see here is, in fact, what they're actually doing for online marketing. They're tracking behavior, they're generating leads, they're running campaigns, etc., etc. So by looking at that, we can already kind of get an understanding of potential systems that might be involved, or just functionality that is required, without necessarily describing in very much detail what or how this is going to work. Okay, and why is that beneficial? Because we're not getting lost in detail and really have an elevated view. And now, if we take it a little bit further, if you think about, we need for B2C a product catalog. We can actually think, okay, they already have an SAP application to manage the product catalog, so there is potentially the necessity to integrate with SAP. So what can we do with the business capability map? In fact, we can use this to map capabilities to system and create a joint view that is understandable to business as well as to IT. So continuing with my B2C example, there is an online shop that might be handled by Shopify, by Commerce Cloud, or whatsoever. We have a product catalog that is managed by Salesforce, but we also understand, hey, we need to have this available in Salesforce. And what we can do here is we can, in fact, map this to a particular application. So if you think about it, first of all, we have the domain. This is B2C. What are we trying to achieve? We need to have a product catalog. Where do we need to have it? Okay, SAP and Salesforce. And what are the applications that are corresponding? In SAP, it's the inventory management. Salesforce, it's the Sales Cloud. Okay. So I hope this is understandable for everybody. Again, if you have questions, please raise them later. By the way, Neha, would you be able to kind of monitor the chat if anything urgent comes up, because I can't pay attention to the chat while talking? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. We'll take up all the questions just after you end your session.
Cool.
Yeah, we'll go through them one by one. Yeah. Okay.
I appreciate that. So now, coming from this elevated view of really understanding the larger business perspective, let's look into the more detailed level of business process deep dive. Now, what's really going on in the business? And what I see very often is when I'm working with technical consultants, they are very much focused on the requirement level. But in order to implement a requirement successfully, and not only that, but in fact implement it in the right way, we really need to understand the relevant aspects of the business processes. And what we're going to do here is we're going to go through the checklist, because imagine, how often have you received only half-baked or partial requirements? I'm pretty sure this happens to you on every other project, right? But being able to understand business processes in more detail can help you fill those gaps or reach out to the customer. And some of the benefits, and I'm not going to read through all of those, but the business process deep dive really can help you to address functional and non-functional aspects, even so they may not yet be covered by written requirements. So you can actually reach out and say, hey, what about this? What about that? Have you considered this report? And the questions that you will find here in part of this session, you can really use as a checklist and start adding your own question. But now enough about theory, let's look into how this looks specifically. So our goal for the project is to implement the sales process in Salesforce. And here our example is a B2B process. I guess everybody is familiar. We have a reseller who submits potentially an RFP. We have a sales user who creates it and sends a quote from Salesforce. We get an order back and we close the deal. That is in fact what happens in Salesforce and what the requirements are written for. But by taking a deeper look into the business process and understand it in its entirety, we can actually get more information. So let's look at what happens after the deal is closed. Oh, in fact, we're going to ship the order because we're talking here about physical goods and we need to invoice the customer from the finance department. So a couple of things that come to our mind when we are looking into those processes is, for instance, hey, what about delivery times? Do we need to have an integration from the warehouse application that can give the customer an indication of what the delivery times are going to be? Should we bring in any kind of tracking IDs that the customer can use to track their current shipping? Or do we even need to bring in an outstanding invoice amount to decide whether we are going to send the goods or even close the order with the customer or not, here with our RFP? So what are a couple of things that are relevant here? I've provided you with a basic checklist, and you're more than welcome to extend it again with your own questions. So it's really about like goals and objectives. What are we trying to achieve with this business process? And what are the objectives that really define that we have accomplished those? What, sorry, the actors and licenses involved in the process, but also the entities and systems that we actually need to drive this process. Yeah? It's about you understanding the entire process and what are the different pieces that are flowing in. Yeah. The business events and the life cycle, and I'm going to get to business entities, the life cycle in a bit, but it's about taking the business perspective and understanding what are significant events that are happening. Oh, we receive an RFP. What does that actually mean? What activities need to take place, maybe outside or inside of the system? What about, sorry, what about data and analytics? What kind of data do we need to drive this process? What are the boundaries? So where does our process in fact end and start and hands over to another process? What are related to dependent processes? And as an architect, of course, we have to be concerned about any kind of regulations that are relevant. Really trying to understand how it is currently done to learn from potential mistakes, but also from things that work really well. Understanding and appreciating the process maturity. So imagine if you have a process that is rather immature, you're probably not going to go, you shouldn't necessarily go with full custom development, but rather go with the low impact approach to allow for the process to mature, and as it matures, for you to adopt your solution accordingly. Okay. And to be frank, like I wouldn't necessarily expect someone to know all of those questions immediately, right? And not even that, but at least being able to articulate those questions in order to gain a more detailed understanding. And the more detailed your understanding is, the better your solution can be. Okay, good. Coming to the next one, the business entity model, or how I label it, the logical versus the physical reality. You know, you need to appreciate I'm working extensively with people who want to become technical architects. The challenge that I continuously see is that they try to go right into the ERD. How am I going to implement this in the Salesforce data model? Okay, but the problem is when we are going right into the physical representation of how we're going to model the business here, we are not only restricting ourselves, but it's also really hard to communicate. So the business entity model really helps us to create a logical structure of the entire business domain that we can use as a foundation and as a means to communicate with the business. Because if you think about an ERD, you know, it's using Salesforce terminology. A customer may not necessarily understand what an opportunity in Salesforce term means, because they might be using the term deal or proposal or whatsoever. You can't hand it over without an additional explanation. And it normally doesn't necessarily contain important attributes. So for me, a good starting point is, before you even start creating the physical EID, start with a business entity model. But how would the sales process in fact look like in a classical Salesforce EID? Okay? So with the opportunity, we have a relationship to the user, to the role, opportunity line items, price book entry, and so on. You know, for us as Salesforce experts, that's fairly logical, but even we don't really understand how this is going to represent the entirety of the business organization. Okay? So here comes the business entity model. So what we're using here is we're first of all using customer or business terminology that makes it easier for them to understand. So for instance, our opportunity is now a deal, and an account, in fact, is a customer. And the deal is owned by an account manager. So if you go back, here we have the opportunity versus the user versus deal and account manager. That speaks to the business. That is something that they can understand. And an account manager is part of a sales organization, part of the region, okay? Versus user belonging to a particular role. Okay. I've included a link here in the presentation for you to learn more about business entity models, and I highly encourage you to consider using them. Because, for instance, if you look here on the position object, it provides you not only with physical entities, here in that case it's the opportunity line item, but significant attributes such as the price, the quantity, and the discount that is relevant. And it can really act as an intermediary step to the EAD. Now, coming to another important aspect is the gap analysis. I very often see that people are just throwing customization at a particular problem without really fully understanding what the business requirement is and how we can address this particular gap with different kinds of options. So the gap analysis is really a structured approach that can help you identify what are the ideal solution options in order to address that. Because fundamentally, it first of all identifies the limitations, and it gives you an opportunity to kind of revisit and challenge requirements in order to make this a better fit with standard or declarative functionality. And for me, I use it as a foundation to drive build or buy decisions with the customer. Is that maybe something that we just want to buy in form of a managed package, or is that really something that we need to fully customize? And of course, we can use it as a means to prioritize requirements and really tell the customer, okay, this is how long it is going to take or not. And now looking into the specifics of a gap analysis process, we start with the analyze phase, And in order to make this more tangible, let's think about the B2B business process that we had seen before. For deals that are larger than $50,000, they must be reviewed and signed off by the user's line manager. So now let's try to match this against standard Salesforce functionality. Can we use a basic approval process? Yes, because there is a hierarchical relationship between users that we can use to define the line manager. So the result is yes, there is no gap for us, it's a good fit. Let's take another example here. So in case of a discount that is larger than 20%, we need to also get a sign-off from a controller that is part of the account's team, so stored in the account team member object. Is that something that we can achieve with a standard approval process? No, it's not, because that's a gap and we can't just make that lookup. So how do we actually find the necessary or like the possible options, and how do we evaluate those? So before we go into identification, let's think about evaluation criteria. What's the effort going to be? Is it even worth it? What's the bigger picture? Do we want to keep this low code versus highly customizable and dynamic? Is it even aligned with our architectural principles? And what does the impact mean? And based on that, we can evaluate the options that we identify. So we can use a lookup on the account. Maybe we use a flow to query the additional approver as part of the submission process. We can use an Apex trigger, or we use a custom approval process. Okay. In the real world example that I actually, or like the real world case that I used here as the foundation, we decided to go with the flow to query the approver. And when it comes to gaps, it's not only important to understand the implications and the necessary criteria, but it can also be helpful to classify and assess those to get an overall picture of the complexity or the deviation from standards for the overall project. So for instance, we can classify those gaps of how we can address them with solution options. What does that mean as a change type? What's the impact? And what's the effort size? And when it comes to sizing, I personally prefer t-shirt sizes as a starting point, because we can use that as a foundation to create better buckets. Good. And now coming to our last one, and I think one of the most important ones as an architect, it is really about thinking in systems. Yeah. So you remember the saying, the whole is larger than the sum of its parts. That's exactly what systems thinking is about. Yeah? Because we want to understand our solution in terms of how all the components of this solution work as a system and contribute to achieving whatever the system is supposed to achieve. And we started with the business capability map, which gave us the larger business perspective or the elevated view. This is really from a technology perspective, and we can use that to understand implications of our design choices and avoid costly mistakes. So it's important here when it comes to systems thinking that even so, our primary concern is Salesforce. It very often is only a piece in a puzzle, and we need to take ourselves out of this restricted view of this is all about Salesforce. So let's take here an example. And what you can see is a functional architecture, which kind of just describes what the different capabilities are. And what you can see here is we have a web shop application that integrates with order management. Okay, the web shop is going to be provided by an external system, and order management is going to be provided by Salesforce. And we're integrating the information or the order processing and history from the web shop into Salesforce. So now if we think about, if you're processing the orders in bulk, they are processed with delays, and the logistic system like the inventory system that is receiving the instructions for fulfillment will not be fully aware of the promised orders and the shipments. Hence, the availability of the stock levels is not necessarily wrong, and the availability in the shop is wrong. So a customer could potentially order something that is not available. On the other hand, if you think about processing orders in bulk, can be helpful in order to be more scalable during peak times such as Christmas, and overall can reduce the infrastructure cost and lead to a higher stability, simply because we're changing here how we're receiving the order data from the web shop into Salesforce and into the respective inventory system. Okay, so now think about it. We have a single integration from an external system into Salesforce, which in fact has a feedback loop. Why another system going into the web shop? And this is really what systems thinking is. Taking an elevated perspective, understanding the pieces, also using the business process deep dive, and arriving at a perspective of how to approach or solve a particular problem. Okay. So systems thinking is not only limited to system architecture, but it's also about like really customer interactions and delivery. And I'm going to give you an example. So I was dealing with a customer in the life sciences industries, and for those of you who are not familiar with it, the testing requirements when it comes to patient security and health are extreme. Okay, and those requirements really put us in a situation where we had, where it just took us like 4 weeks to deploy a single field from development or from the sandbox into production. So now taking a systemic approach and looking at that, what we were actually able to map out is a multi-pipeline approach where we could have multiple streams running in parallel, taking into consideration the availability of backend test systems and regulatory requirements. Okay. And again, that is really a result of systemic thinking and trying to understand all the pieces that are involved in order to come up with a solution proposal that is in line with what is necessary. Okay. Good. So coming towards the end of my formal presentation. So how can you actually make use of the weapons that I've shown to you? So first of all, don't try to reinvent the wheel. I'm pretty sure there are already existing artifacts within your company that you can use as a starting point. Yeah? So for instance, from ERDs, start creating business entity models. When you're creating your artifacts, you don't always have to reinvent the wheel, but you can really reuse and recycle them. And the tools are not really useful if you're just keeping them to yourself, but really use them as a means of communication to engage with your team and your client to validate. Yeah. And store them in a repository, use document management to put governance around it. And what I can promise you is by applying those tools and weapons, your design will improve. Good. That is my presentation so far. Let's have a quick look. Oh, just 27 chat messages. Okay, I hope those are not all questions.
Hey, Sebastian, can I fire a quick question?
Yeah, sure you can.
Thank you. That was really a great presentation. So I got the main point, but usually what I'm facing, clients really hiring solution architects to solve the pain point. Basically, they have the problem. There is a new project, like huge integration. They need to connect some systems, right? They need to deliver, or they need to have a right person to build the communication between IT and business, or between dev teams. There is no time to start with the business.
Andre, sorry, for the sake of time, what's your question there?
Well, in my position, do I always need to start from business architecture, or there is like plan first, deliver what the client asking you to do, and then go into deep dive and see the big picture?
Okay, thank you for the question. So I think the problem often with doing what the client is asking us is the client doesn't necessarily know what they need. And for us, it can be problematic to kind of respond if you don't have the full picture. So while I don't necessarily would suggest to go through all of those weapons as a full and detailed exercise, starting to get an overall feel for the surrounding business context in which you're operating is not only beneficial, it is in fact, it is crucial in order to come up with a solid solution proposal. Depending on the size and the complexity, there might be more detailed analysis required versus more high level, okay? But I wouldn't, to be honest, I wouldn't feel comfortable even delivering like a CPQ or like a basic service cloud solution without understanding, okay, what's going on around and just reading requirements from the customer. If that answers your question.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have one more question from Lucas. That is why the ERD normally don't include important attributes. The one ERD that you showed, right? So it only consisted of the object name. So basically, I think he wants to ask that why it doesn't include the important attributes. So yeah, over here.
Of course, it can include the important attributes, but the way those ERDs are normally modeled is you have like the title of the object and then just a list of attributes that are not necessarily representing. So they're representing the API name of the field rather than the business meaning. Okay. Of course, you can include it, but what I can also promise you, if you have a fairly large and complex business, or a fairly large and complex ERD, it will become very hard to comprehend if you're including all of those important aspects. Okay. The business entity model, on the other hand, is more focused on a particular business domain. Okay, but it still can be rather big. Okay. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. Can I ask you something else about the business entity model? Is this something that you would use in front of a CTA review board, like to describe your understanding? Do you have time to come up with something like that, or?
So here's the thing for the CTA board. Sorry. Oh man, I'm failing to navigate. This is what you are expected to produce as an artifact. And by the way, Johannes has produced a couple of really good YouTube videos on drawing in PowerPoint, because this one doesn't include the full level of detail and annotations. However, here's the thing, like the EAD is what you're producing, but the business entity model is in fact what you're going to talk about, right? Because the expectation of the board is you articulating how this EAD is used to represent the reality of the business.
Mm-hmm.
I can follow up there. We just did a mock exam today with a couple of study partners, and they are super deep into the topic, but I made the mistake of not talking about the business entity, just stating the API names, and none of them could follow my solution. They were completely lost. Especially if it's a long, complex one.
Yeah.
Can I ask you something, Seb, because we have a huge group of a lot of really great developers, I think, people who are really deep into tech. What's the biggest challenge you see for these kind of people going for the architect route?
Where to start? Where to start? Because, you know, like it's the expectation based on the title of the exam, which is Certified Technical Architect, doesn't reflect the reality of the demands and objectives. And I guess you can fully agree that that a lot of the stuff that we are actually focusing on are models and patterns that is about understanding, in fact, what the business is after, what are the risks and the implications are. So if someone is working in a narrow like in a role that is rather narrowed on technical understanding, bridging that gap of kind of putting on that solution architect and program architect hat is going to be a challenge. And I mean, Johan, you've worked as a product manager, you know, I'm pretty sure you can very much appreciate your experience of kind of taking more the business perspective in addressing those scenarios.
Yeah, follow up there. Maybe what's your tip on how for people to overcome this gap?
Get involved in customer workshops, work in pre-sales, work on RFPs, engage with the business. I have not seen a single certified technical architect who has not worked in a business-facing or client-facing role with a degree of leadership. Easy as that. And I also appreciate that this might not necessarily be what a lot of people want to hear, but that is the harsh reality, and this takes time. It really takes time to grow the necessary skills. So anybody who thinks, oh, I can become a CTA within like 1 or 2 years without this kind of experience, it's unlikely to happen.
Another question, quick question. Would you agree, Sebastian, that let's say Java solution architect or .NET solution architect, comparing with the Salesforce solution architect, the difference will be minimum. The difference will be only the technology aspect, but all deliverables which they need to produce pretty similar.
The problem is I don't have a reference to what .NET or Java solution architect entails. Okay, but what I can give you as an example is Carl Brundage. He's a CTA and he works as a master architect for Odeseva. Okay, he was an AWS solution architect and had been actively involved in developing products outside of Salesforce, and he managed to become a CTA within 18 months of getting involved in the Salesforce ecosystem. So there is a huge foundation that is technology agnostic that will help you achieve that goal.
Okay, so we have more questions coming in the chat.
Okay.
So the question in the lineup is, how come ERDs use different language than business entity models? Wouldn't it be preferable to use the same words in designs or code as in communication with the business?
Absolutely not, because this is what your developer understands, but your business doesn't necessarily understand it without the necessary onboarding. This is what the business understands, but not the developer without the necessary onboarding. Okay. The business entity model is using customer specific terminology in order to enable the necessary communication. Okay. And we use that as a foundation for the ERD. You know, and the thing is, it's everybody who's creating an ERD effectively does a business entity model in their mind. Right? Because they're like, oh, I have customers and I have resellers, like how do I map this to Salesforce? Okay, but now imagine if I use Salesforce terminology. Yeah? Here, for instance, the account manager and the sales organization and the region, we have a user and a role. Okay, the user is a member of a role, Like that doesn't really tell anything. Does it make sense?
To me, yes. I think
Okay.
you also understood. So we'll have one more last question for today. If anyone else has other questions, then that can be taken online or Twitter on your social handle, Sebastian, right? So the next.
I'm not really active on Twitter at the moment. So if you have specific questions, post them on LinkedIn. I'm going to read that more likely.
Okay, so the very last question is from Garima. So she asked that while creating a high-level solutions, I sometimes face issues as I have a habit of going through detailed scenarios. But sometimes clients just say to ignore this, but I feel those can impact the solution, including data model. What is the best way to handle such scenarios?
So the question is how to find the necessary level of detail. Is that correct?
I think so, yes.
Yes.
For high-level solutions, correct.
Wow, that is a. Do we have an hour? Now let's be here realistic for a second. I think there is a very fine balance when it comes to finding the necessary level of detail. And for me, it is more important to understand the key requirements that are driving the architectural decisions. You know, let me give you an example. If you have a requirement with a customer and having to send 40 different emails, okay? Like I'm not too concerned about the specifics of all of those 40 different emails. What I want to understand is what are the key exceptions? Do we have emails that require more than, I don't know, like more than 3 objects in grandparent relationships that we can't necessarily access? What is the complexity of those? Okay, so rather than getting lost in too much detail, it can help understand to breaking it down into concepts and buckets in order to arrive at the solution. But that is a very general response, I'm afraid.
Did that answer your question, Garima? I suppose it's.
We take that as a yes.
There's one last question. I would be super interested, Seb, to take you. I know we already are over the time, but what's the value of getting CTA if you're not planning to joining a large organization? I'm personally curious.
Like you're becoming the best version of a consultant that you can be. And this is not about monetary value, but everybody who goes through the preparation to become a CTA will come out differently at the end. I can promise you that, because this is going to put all of your skills at the ultimate test. It's about business analysis, communication, problem solving, objection handling, presentation, like the whole shebang that makes a good professional is included in that exam, and this is why it's so challenging. So that's the value.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian.
No, you're most welcome. Neha, what I can also do is I can share the presentation with you guys, so that you can. What's the mean of distributing the deck?
LinkedIn usually. If you upload it on LinkedIn in the slide share or something, we include the link in the video.
Okay. Yeah. This might take a couple of days because I'm really tapped out at the moment, but I will deliver on my promise. Good. Okay. Giving up the power, who am I going to nominate? Neha, this is all on you.
Thank you, Sebastian.
Make you host again.
And I think I will be able to share now. Yeah. So while we learned about the secret weapons of being a great architect, we'll proceed to our session 2, which is Salesforce data privacy, GDPR, and the road to success. So I would be giving the sharing rights to Saurabh, our next presenter.
Thank you, Neha. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yep.
All right. Oh, looks like I have. Continue. Give me just a sec. All right, so you should be able to see my presentation deck now, right?
Yep.
All right, cool. So thanks everyone for having me. And I think I have a pretty big challenge following this very excellent presentation that Sebastian did. And thank you so much, Johan, Gaurav, Neha, for coordinating this. Really appreciate this. I think there is a lot more in the architecture space that needs to happen. And I used to work for Salesforce, and I think this kind of information in general is hard to come by. So I think it's a really great endeavor that you guys have put together. So my name is Saurabh Gupta, and today we are going to talk about Salesforce data privacy and enterprise architecture. I have done a lot of presentations in this space, but this is a very different and unique presentation, specifically because of the audience here. So my intention here is threefold. Before I get into this presentation, I just want to kind of caveat that. The three things I'm hoping that you'd be able to take away from this presentation is, one, a really good understanding of data privacy, what it means in terms of Salesforce when you're talking to your customers and they throw words like GDPR, Ccpa, LGPD, or something else like that. What does it mean? What does it translate into? The second thing is, what are your options? What are the tools in your toolkit when you're looking to address this, whether they come from, the Salesforce platform, whether they come from third-party vendors, whether they come from Salesforce itself as separate products that Salesforce has created for this, right? And the third thing is, I'm hoping that by the time this presentation ends, you have a really good understanding of some of the internals and nuances and the questions that enterprise architects and just in general, anyone who's operating in this space is able to answer. One of my colleagues said something really interesting a long time ago that I so like till this date. An architect is someone who has an informed point of view, right? So that's what this whole deck and this presentation, everything you're doing is so that you have an informed point of view. You don't have to know everything in depth, but you have enough understanding and you can put things in the right perspective. So with that, let's move on with this. So let me start off with our version of Safe Harbor. This is not legal advice. I do not represent Salesforce's perspective. This is our point of view. This is my point of view, my company's point of view, based on a lot of research we have done, what we have heard from Salesforce, what we have heard from customers, what we have heard from data privacy professionals. So that's what this is. Thank you so much for taking the time to attend. We are thankful to folks who are our customers and who have entrusted their their faith in us. Thank you all for being here. And we really appreciate your support. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to talk about a couple of different things. So I would definitely introduce me in a minute here, and then we can talk about what are data privacy laws and why should you or your company or your customer or your client, why should any of them worry about it? Then we'll talk about what sort of technology capabilities should you think about from a data privacy compliance perspective. What kind of Salesforce features exist? What other options exist? What are some of the considerations? And I've tried to put some resources, some of the things that we've been spending a lot of time in this space. So just places where you could go and get more information, and then we can do questions and answers. And if there are like other areas that we need to cover, please just put them in the chat. And when we get to Q&A, we'll try to cover them. One more thing on this is that this is a really, really, really large topic. Typically, I would spend about 2 hours. So you are a little bit drinking from the fire hose here. So it's going to be a lot of information. This is very content heavy, which is completely by design for this group of people. My hope is that I want to pack as much as I can in the 45 minutes or whatever time we have been provided here. All right, so moving on. My name is Saurabh Gupta. I used to work for Salesforce. I was there for about 7+ years, and I left about 1.5 years ago. I was the Senior Director for Enterprise Architecture there, and I left because I felt like, all these laws are coming, and there's an excellent opportunity for people to kind of go and address this problem. So I am the founder and CEO of a company called From Cloud Labs, and we produce a native ISV app for data privacy called Cloud Compliance. So vast majority of what I'm going to talk about, I only know because I've spent the last more than 1.5 years just kind of digging through, reading some of these texts, understanding them, and translating them into a technology solution. By background, I'm an enterprise architect. I've spent the last 10 years in enterprise architecture, and prior to that, in a bunch of other technologies. I did Salesforce, Siebel, I did Microsoft, Oracle, things like that. I have a degree in design, so I'm not a technical guy. I have a master's in design and an MBA. I like to consider myself as a problem solver, and I'm based in Chicago. So with that out of the way, let's talk about data privacy laws. What are data privacy laws? You will hear these terms like GDPR, Ccpa, LGPD, PIPEDA, and PDPB in India, which is going to come shortly. So there is a ton of data privacy laws that are emerging or have been enforced all around the world. GDPR is for EU residents, Ccpa is for Californians, LGPD is for Brazilians, PIPEDA is for Canada, and PDPB is for Indian residents. It's not yet enforced. It's in their parliament. It'll hopefully get through in probably a couple of months or a few quarters. So what these privacy laws really mean is these privacy laws give us, the end person, the natural human in this whole business and customer relationship, these people like us are called data subjects, particularly in GDPR, right? So data subjects have privacy rights. Before these laws came, we did not have that many rights. If you wanted your information from a Facebook or an Apple or an Uber or whoever, they may or may not give it to you, right? You were just dependent on them. But now under data privacy laws, they are by law required to address those kind of requests. These laws also mandate that our information, personal data of individuals, is treated lawfully, fairly, and transparently. And all of these things actually have a legal interpretation, but we don't have time to go through all that. But just understand that there is a set of rules that every business in these, who's handling data of Europeans, Californians, Brazilians, and all of those folks, those businesses are obligated to follow certain laws, certain regulations with how they treat personal data. And as you see this weaponization of technology and artificial intelligence and machine learning and online profiling and online tracking and all of that, this space is going to continue to heat up. Personal data privacy rights will keep on coming out. India is going to be probably the most, the next largest, entity in the world to kind of roll this out. And I'm sure there are others that are on the anvil. There's a work going on. I think Switzerland just approved something because they have a different version than I think GDPR. I know Russia has something in the making. Israel has something in the making. So there's a lot of work happening in this space. California is going to come up with 2.0 version of CCPA, which will be on the ballot in November. So this space is going to continue to heat up. This is really important for people in the Salesforce world, because if there's one application in an enterprise that has personal data of people, it's the CRM, right? So that's why I think this topic is fairly relevant, and Salesforce is doing an incredible amount of work in this space. The third part of this that is really crucial to understand, particularly when you think of it as a technologist and as an architect, is around consent. It's about understanding how we respect customers' preferences, how we seek their permission to market to them, to engage them, and to build trust. I specifically call out consent because there's a lot of ramifications of it when you think of it from an architectural perspective. So 3 simple things, right? There are privacy laws that accord us privacy rights, and consent is something intertwined with all of this. And we'll discuss these in a bit more detail. So why bother? Why do you care about it? You want to care about it because there is a significant penalty associated with these rights, with these laws. On an average, a GDPR fine, just to kind of address, any sort of a deficiency, can be $81,000, which is not a huge amount, but it is non-trivial. The other thing is GDPR actually is one of the most stringent in terms of its penalties. It could be up to 4% of a company's annual revenue. That's a huge amount of money for a company to pay. If you're a technologist talking to people in business, I'm sure particularly with GDPR, because it's been around for almost 2 years now. So a lot of businesses understand this in Europe. But if you're talking to businesses, make sure that they understand it's not just the fine. It's the risk of embarrassment, of brand value, of reputation. These data breaches and these sort of fines also have a direct impact on the stock prices if a company is listed. So there is a lot that is behind why you need to bother with this. All right. So having said all of that, a question that almost always comes up, and it's a really good idea to address very initially, is what's the difference between data privacy and data security, and what are the myths around it? So data privacy is a bit different from data security. So privacy is all about appropriate usage of this information, how we collect, how do we retain it, how often do we keep it, how long do we keep it for, when do we delete it, how do we store it, why do we store it? So all of that falls under data privacy, and our conversation today is predominantly on data privacy. It's different from data security because security is really all about securing that information. So all the policies, all the methods, all the means that we have. So permission sets, right? Single sign-on, shield, a lot of that stuff is really not data privacy, it's data security. Having said that, this is, sort of a loose working definition in my mind, because with so many vendors, so much noise in this space, it's very hard to draw the line. And while data privacy laws may not mandate in some areas very specific security guidelines, the ability to meet data privacy laws often requires data security considerations. But just be aware that they are, 2 different things, and a lot of vendors will tell you, oh, you got to buy this, you got to do that. And sometimes the laws don't say that. So from that perspective, when you look at data privacy laws, there are these 2 myths that you will almost always hear. A lot of conversation in data privacy happens on what is known as data residency. I'm a company based in somewhere in Europe. So should my data only be in this country? Should it only be in Germany? Should it only be in UK or France or wherever? Most data privacy laws don't have a direct clause for data residency. There is a recent ruling that happened which prohibits EU data going to United States because of an agreement that was there that now got sort of invalidated. But outside of that, data residency is really not a legal requirement from a privacy law perspective. There are countries, particularly China and Russia, that have data residency or data localization regulations, but GDPR, CCPA, LGPD, in fact, PDPB from India as well, don't have a data localization requirement. Just be aware, because every time you're going to try and address this in an organization, someone's going to bring this up. They may do it because they want it. They may do it because their customers want it. And that's not uncommon. I've seen that quite a few times, but the privacy laws themselves don't require these things. The second part of this is what I mentioned earlier, things like encryption and data security. You may again do it because you want to be a responsible organization. You may do it because you have data privacy laws that have a consequence that is better addressed through these. But in particular, you don't, most data privacy laws don't mandate some sort of encryption. They do ask for the best possible mechanisms that you can apply to keep people's data, safe and secure, but they don't mandate that you should buy Shield or you should buy this or you should do that. All right, so that's on data privacy versus security myth. Let me go to the next step. So what does that translate into? What's the market doing in this space? What we see typically with customers in EU and US, and those two regions primarily because GDPR happened and then CCPA happened, and Brazil's LGPD just went live about, I think, 3 weeks ago. So it's still very early for us to have an opinion on that. But what we see with our European and US customers and prospects and people we speak with is that there is definitely a very, very strong need to have a robust consent and preference management that can be applied across marketing, sales, service. And I'm going to talk a bit more into what's the scope of these things. Just think of these as high-level summaries and we'll get to that. Right. So that's kind of the first thing. The second is there is a lot of emphasis on the transparency to communicate data processing practices. So having better privacy policies, terms and conditions, statements in different languages for different regions, things like that. Also communicating when you're filling in a lead gen form, right? So if you sign up for a webinar like this one, if you download a white paper, how's your information going to get processed? There's a lot of focus on making sure that that gets communicated clearly to folks. And the third thing along those lines is a lot of data privacy rights. So, as I mentioned earlier, under these laws, you can have a right for data deletion, a right for portability, right for access. So a lot of that kind of stuff is what's driving these markets. And this is kind of where we see a lot of emphasis being put. Particularly also from a Salesforce perspective. So with that, let's move on and talk about what does data privacy compliance really mean? What's the scope of it? So think of it as very high-level requirements for data privacy, and then we'll translate them what they mean from a Salesforce perspective and how we can address them. So let's look at a data privacy area. What's the scope? And then as an architect, what's the kind of approach you should take? What do you want to think about? How much do you get engaged in? What kind of architectural challenges do you see? And, when I was putting this together and I had a brief conversation with Johan before this, and, he mentioned that a lot of folks on this call are preparing for CTS. So I'm going to cover a little bit more on my own speculation of what may be relevant from a CTA perspective on this. But this is useful to you no matter whether you're preparing for CTA or not, whether you're an architect or not. I'm hoping that what you take away from this is what technical areas do these set of requirements really convert into? So let's do this. So the first one is privacy policy and related processes. This is the first major area. Think of it really as the core or foundational. And this includes how do we treat someone's data? We have to communicate that, right? Every company's website you go to, they have their privacy policy or privacy statements, as it's called legally, and the terms and conditions. So you can go read their privacy statements. How are they, processing your data? What kind of technologies do they use? Do they use a tracking technology? Things like that. The second part of this is what is known as a data privacy impact assessment, or a DPIA, which is a very specific term to GDPR. But a number of other privacy regulations are also starting to do that. And the third part of this is, to do this well, both the DPI and privacy statements, you really need to do a really good personal data inventory. What kind of information do we have on customers, on leads, on employees, on partners, right? What kind of personal data do we have? Who do we get it from? Who do we share it with? How long do we keep it? Is it personally identifiable information, personal health information, like a lot of nuances of this. So this is sort of the broad scope. And my suggestion to people who are not in this space, and this is just after spending a lot of time in this space, my suggestion to folks is when you see these things, there are parts of it that we can address from a Salesforce perspective, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. But this is the area where you want to really sort of take a little bit of a backseat and really be, on the solutioning side of it a bit more, and let a vast majority of this be driven by subject matter expertise, which could be their internal legal counsel or, a DPO or some other privacy consulting company that they may have. Predominantly because a vast majority of this really has to some degree some process architecture work, some automation, some third-party tools, but there's not that much architecturally interesting, in my opinion, to be addressed directly by technology folks. This is really more on the legal side. The rest of them are a bit more interesting than this. The second part of this is privacy rights management. Under GDPR, the term used is data subject access requests. So you may hear from your business or legal counterparts about DSARs. So basically what that means is under these privacy laws, you have rights. And interestingly enough, whether you are a EU resident, a Californian, a Brazilian, or an Indian, these rights to some degree are part of all of these regulations. They have nuances of how soon do you do it, how much time do you get, what isn't considered personal information. But outside of those nuances, literally every one of these privacy laws would mandate some version of these rights. So what these rights mean is, if you signed up, with an organization, if you filled a lead gen form, for example, you can then go and ask them for your information. If you're a customer, you can go to your cell phone company or utility company and ask for your information. That is called right to data portability. You can also ask for companies to remove your information, which is right to be forgotten, also known as data erasure or deletion, or can be done by anonymization. You can ask for them to fix your information if it is incorrect. And these are all legal rights now under these laws, right? So privacy rights management, that whole space in DSR is about how do we facilitate a self-service where someone can go and make a request for this, right? Whether do you do communities or Web2 case, or do you integrate with some other request intake third-party system? So a lot of self-service, that's the approach that you want to think about here. You also want to think about automation. So whether it's flows or Apex or third-party tools, right? Things like that. And a very, very important component of this is integration. Because if someone said they want to be, they want their data to be removed and they exercise their right to be forgotten, Salesforce is not the only game in town, right? At any large enterprise, you would have to remove this information in Salesforce, in your ERP, SAP, or whatever you have, Oracle, right? You'd have to remove it potentially from e-commerce, from analytics, from backups, right? So there's a lot of those kind of things that have to happen. And a really excellent use case for integration, particularly in very large enterprises. Some of our customers have like another separate data privacy platform, typically like a OneTrust or TrustArc or Nimity, or one of those large ones that just specifically focus on privacy. And then they make API calls, and in Salesforce and other systems, this information needs to be anonymized or extracted out for portability. That's the kind of stuff we do. But the point is, if you're an architect, when you think of this space, think integration, think self-service, think automation. Those are your three sort of broad areas to think about in this space. So the third point here is around consent and communication preference management. And the idea here is, under a lot of these laws, particularly under GDPR, you cannot just process anyone's data. And processing data is again a legal term. It basically means you can't store someone's information, you can't access it, you can't send them marketing emails, you can't apply artificial intelligence on it, you can't do business intelligence on it, you can't do data profiling on it. So all of that is considered data processing. And under these laws, particularly under GDPR and I believe under LGBT, you need explicit consent. The person has to give you an informed consent. They have to say, I'm okay with you processing my data, with you sending me marketing emails, with you, applying AI, BI, profiling, whatever, right? So that is what consent and communication preference is all about. And Salesforce has done a ton of stuff in this space. Like the platform has incredible capabilities to address it. It definitely takes a bit of solutioning around it, but there's a lot of stuff there. The scope of this also extends beyond Salesforce because you now have to integrate it with a marketing cloud or Pardot or Marketo or Eloqua, whatever your customer has or your company has. And the intention is that you're centralizing your consent and communication preferences, and then you can synchronize them with these other tools that can then behave accordingly. So at the end of it, we are building, better relationship with our customers and deepening the trust because we are being respectful of their choices. If I said that, please don't send me SMS for your coupons, then don't send me SMS. If I say I'm okay with you sending me an email for those, great, send me an email. And to be able to understand those channels and to utilize them and how long do you have consent and preferences available for those kind of things take a bit of work. That's the set of requirements. But when you put on your architecture hat, what this really translates into under the hood, this is 100% a master data management scenario. You have to kind of think about where am I mastering information on the customer itself? Where am I going to master these consents and communication preferences? What is going to be, the system of record versus potentially different source systems and synchronization that I'm doing of this information to other systems? How am I going to integrate this? I didn't put the term here actually, but a lot of this, just when we say MDM, under the hood, like a lot of this is really deep thinking on data architecture. How is this going to be modeled? How is going to be kept in sync across multiple systems? And what are the processes, governance, technology integration that I'm going to apply to this, right? So that's when you're thinking about this from an architecture space, think about it from an MDM point of view and a number of these things. The fourth section of this is really about personal data management. How do you manage this information that you have, because you automated all the rights for it, you have some policies around it, you're managing consents, and now how do you really manage it? And what this last bullet means is, how do we reduce the amount of personal data we are processing? This is a pretty hard requirement in GDPR particularly, and also actually under Ccpa and LGBT. And the intention is that in the past, and I worked for companies where they literally had personal data of their customers from like 30, 40 years ago. They had tape backups of this data because they were in finance, insurance, something like this, and they would never, ever delete anything. And probably some of you may have worked for such companies. This all changes with privacy laws. Under GDPR, you have to have a data policy, and you can only keep information for a certain amount of time. So if I say I'm going to keep, if my legal says that I'm going to keep personal information of our ex-customers for 3 years, great. After 3 years, I better get rid of it. I either anonymize it, delete it, or do something. So that whole thing is called data retention or data minimization. The other aspect that I want to cover here is we talked a little bit about security. One of the things with a number of data privacy laws is that you have to apply some of the best technology capabilities to reduce your data breach footprint. Because if you have a data breach, you now have a very small timeline to communicate it to the regulators in your country and to actually address it. So one of the things that has come out of it, which has become really important, is things like sandbox data masking, because your sandbox effectively has your production data with lower security controls. So you may want to mask it. So those are the two things to think about it. in this fourth bullet here. I'm going to take a pause here and see if there are any questions, or Neha, if you have any feedback.
So can we take all the questions in the end? I have a couple of questions coming in the chat, but let's take them in the end.
Okay.
Or do you take them now?
All right, sounds good. Let's do that then. Okay, so let's keep going on. I think I probably have another 15 minutes worth of content, so we'll have plenty of time for questions. So on that, that last one of the points I made on consent, I thought I would put this in there because particularly from an architecture perspective, I find this one of the most interesting areas. The question that as an architect, you would have to at some point address and deal with is, how do you do this? Do you have a single, the option one, which is like, I'm going to keep my customer master as Salesforce and my consent master as Salesforce, and I'll sync it with, marketing apps. I may have a self-service preference center. Or do you go the option 2 route where you have Salesforce and you have a bunch of other apps, and now you may stand up yet another customer consent master, whether that's Salesforce Customer 360 or Informatica's version or someone else's version. There's like a ton of offerings, right? Relate.io, this and that. So that's one of the key questions that every enterprise architect at some point has to address. And it is definitely not a technical question. I really liked what, and someone asked this question from Sebastian and his response on this, because so much of what we are talking about here is hardcore business understanding and business architecture. What's the company trying to do? What's their strategy? What would they do in future? And how would your architecture enable it? That has nothing to do with Salesforce, with CTA, with Apex, with any of that, right? This is just a deep understanding of your company or your customer or your client's business context and addressing this question. Definitely a non-trivial question, probably an hour and a half worth of conversation in itself. But know that from a data privacy perspective, anytime you think about consent and communication preferences, this is something that would come up. All right, so with that, let me go into a bit of technology capabilities for data privacy compliance. And folks, I apologize. I really feel like I'm going through so much and rushing through it, but it's just, I really wanted to make sure that you guys get the most out of this hour, but drink from the fire hose here with me, I'm sorry. So technology capabilities for data privacy compliance. What we will do is we'll take the same 4 areas that we talked about. We will talk about what does the platform offer today, what Salesforce offers out of the box, where you're not paying anything extra. It's not a separate purchase. Out of the box, if you have the platform, you get this. What other choices do you have? Because as an architect, when you go out to address these, there is choices on App Exchange, there are third party, there are other non-Salesforce, non-App Exchange type tools that may be addressing these. And then last column is just my guesses, right? Completely me speculating that if you're taking a review board for CTA, what would they ask from you, right? Or what would they expect your answer to be? So that's kind of the matrix that I wanted to take you guys through. So when you think about privacy policy and related processes, out of the box, Salesforce offers you 2 things. You have metadata classification fields, which are useful for data inventory. You could use them and say, oh, we think this information is personal health information. This is personal information. This is public information. You can do all that classification on the platform. Don't have to pay anything. Don't have to buy anything. You could just do it. Similarly, for having privacy policies and displaying it on your site and have multiple versions, multiple language versions, you can use Salesforce's CMS capabilities. For I think Enterprise Edition and above, it's included. I'm sure there are some limitations to it. I don't know them particularly well, but those are the 2 things in that space you can do. There are third-party offerings from App Exchange. Elements.cloud has I think they do metadata management as well. We do both metadata management, privacy policies, things like that. From a CTA perspective, if this question comes up, I would think that you want to talk about metadata fields in Salesforce CMS. That's what I would think that the review board would be looking for. So that's on this one. Let's talk about privacy rights automation. So this is all of the right to be forgotten, portability, this and that, right? So obviously from a platform perspective, this is automation. So you could use flows, you could do Apex, you could do process builder, workflow, all that amazing declarative stuff that Salesforce offers. One thing in particular to be aware of, which is very interesting, is that in Salesforce, you can't delete a user, right? And let's say if I made a request on the right to be forgotten, and I'm a communities user, you can't delete my record. And if you update my record with some other information, Salesforce would automatically send me, the data subject, an email saying, hey, your data just got updated, and inform me. So to kind of get around that, and specifically for GDPR, Salesforce introduced the obfuscation API. You can call this API from Apex, and you can obfuscate user records and things like that. So when you think about privacy rights automation, particularly right to be forgotten, remember obfuscation API. That's a really nifty capability. And of course, if you're going to build like a preference center or something, you need communities. So what exists there on AppExchange from a third-party perspective is that there is, I think someone has an AppExchange flow. I couldn't remember the vendor name, but there is like a free package you can get, and it just kind of lets you take these kind of requests. We do like a lot of this stuff. We build a whole prepackaged portal that comes in our product, running on communities, doing the same preference center stuff. And under the hood, we also use obfuscation API. So from a CTA perspective, you definitely want to remember obfuscation API. And very recently, like literally in this release, I think it's not even generally available yet, I think, but Customer 360, Salesforce's Customer 360 now has some of these privacy rights automation, I think for right to be forgotten and for portability. So definitely something you may want to read on. And if that comes in, that's probably a really good one to put it there. So that's on this one. Let's talk about the next one, which is very interesting to me. Consent and communication preference management. Salesforce has the individual object. If you're not aware of it, you can definitely read up on it. I have written on it. A bunch of other people have written on it. A lot of information available on it. And after introducing the individual object, since then, Salesforce has introduced like 15, 16 other objects. They are like contact point type, consent, authorization form objects, subscription object. They're all standard object, and they're all in your org today. So if you go and look up your schema, you can see all these objects there. One thing to be aware of, very useful for people appearing for this or even otherwise, if you're proposing a solution to your company, is that data storage in individual and consent objects do not count against your org. This is the only exception with everything else that Salesforce gives you. So you can, stick all kind of consents in there and not pay a cent to Salesforce in data storage. This is an excellent capability, and it tells you how serious Salesforce is in helping its customers meet data privacy requirements. The other thing for that is consent API that Salesforce has provided, I think, for the last 2-3 releases, and it's continually adding more capabilities to it. And the idea of this is that if you're calling from external systems, you have a mobile app, you have a third party, some portal, some other app that is there, an e-commerce thing, a marketing thing, a partner, then they can effectively just call this API and get the most recent, do I have a consent? Do I not have a consent? Do they opt in or opt out for something? You can update these. So, very interesting capability out of the box in the platform that's available to you. In terms of third-party solutions for consent and preference management, Salesforce Labs has a flow that you can deploy for free, and it will let you kind of click through and create some consents. We do a ton of work in this space. We automate all of this, consent creation and managing them and creating like metrics for it. And we've written our own set of APIs to deal with this. Lots of our customers use our stuff as well. So, you have options there. If you go to CTA and in your review board, this comes up, I'm guessing that they're looking for you to say consent API and customer 360. I think that's what I would, I would recommend that you think about and talk. And finally, personal data management. Again, there was two things here, right? There is data retention and there is sandbox data masking. So really out of the box, there is no good capability to do either one. You can write custom Apex. You can maybe do some stuff with Flow for retention, but nothing great. Like you're going to write a lot of Apex if you're going to do that. And you can. I have an article particularly for sandbox data masking. I have an article that talks about, what you can do. Apex has an interface called sandbox post copy. You can do that and write your own data masking if you want. If you don't want to do this, and I suggest don't, a lot of this Apex stuff here is technical debt. It's great for technology people to roll up sleeves and write it, but in the end, it's really not that cheap to do it. And, eventually it becomes a monstrosity. So you have a lot of options in this space. I think even before, data masking became very sort of fashionable, Salesforce Labs had, I think they still have a package. I forgot the name of the lady. She was one of my colleagues, a program architect who actually wrote this, and it uses custom metadata and does some things with it. So anyway, look it up on App Exchange. They do that for data masking. Own Backup, Oda Seva, and other, sort of the Salesforce backup tools and archiving tools. They can do data retention for you. I think some of them also do data masking. Some of these CI/CD tools, like Copado and Flowsum and others, I think they also have some capability to sort of do data anonymization and data seeding when you're, refreshing your sandboxes. If we do that, we've been doing this both retention and data masking for about 1.5 years now. Those are one of the few features we built very early on. So anyway, lots of options in that space. If you go to CTA and if this comes up, I would just stick with either saying Salesforce data masking or any of those App Exchange package. Particularly in this space, be very aware that you have a number of different product categories that can apply, right? You have backup and archiving folks, you have CI/CD, you have dedicated, data masking sort of technologies. So that's the lay of land. I've spent 1.5 years just researching a lot of these things. If there is one slide from this whole presentation that I think you should take away as a technologist, it's probably this one, because you hopefully will have a fairly good idea of what are the sort of tools in your toolkit, what kind of options to pursue and investigate and assess and analyze, and make a determination and make a recommendation to your customer. So with that, and I have a super detailed version of it, which I'm not going to take you through it. They're all on our website. We don't ask for an email or anything because we are in data privacy business. You can just go to our resources, download whatever you like. All of this is there. I wanted to show this in particular because it's much more nuanced and detailed. And I like the fact that this covers security also, right? So if your customer, particularly if you're in financial services, insurance, healthcare, one of those regulated sector companies that really, really want to do both privacy and security, then something like this is very, very handy. You can look at this and go, oh, yes, here I would use Shield, and here I would use, this data masking technology, or I would use, these other tools that exist. So a lot of that stuff exists. The one space where you don't see a lot of good answers is when you're trying to integrate communication and consent management with marketing tools. Sorry.
Saurabh, sorry to interrupt. So we just have 3 more minutes left with the presentation, and then we can start with Q&A.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. So yes, guys, you can go download this. This is plumcloudlabs.com/blog. You can go, there's a ton of these kind of articles, some downloadable material, including the matrix that I was showing you earlier. We also just started another Meetup Group, which is specifically focused on GDPR, Ccpa. If that's of interest, go join it. We started, I think, last week or so. Otherwise, what you're doing is great. So this is my contact information. I'm very active on LinkedIn. That's the preferred mechanism for reaching me. My email address is here. And I think that's it. Thank you very much. I'll give you 2 minutes back, Neha. How's that?
Thank you so much. That was a really interesting question. A few days back, even I was asking these questions to myself as to how do we manage these things in Salesforce, and you sort of answered them. And definitely go to your website to see about your analysis and the technologies that you suggest. That was really very helpful.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Saurabh. Fantastic session. Fantastic session. I think a lot of us understand data privacy from a very high level. I think this was a great deep dive, and I think regardless of whether people are preparing for CTA or not, just these insights into the privacy aspect is fantastic. So thank you once again.
Absolutely. Thanks, Gaurav. Thanks, guys.
And thank you, Neha, for hosting this. I think you did a wonderful job. And as we always do, I mean, we will appreciate people if they want to step up as host for the next session, if they want to speak on certain topics which would be relevant for an architect audience. That would be fantastic. As we say always, this is a free-spirited group. We are all here to learn together. The objective is to kind of do these focus sessions once a month. So if you would like to contribute, reach out to Johan, reach out to me. I believe Neha also has a slide on this. So yeah, you can probably quickly cover this.
Yeah, that's all. Gaurav, you already covered. So later on, we would be sharing all the slides and recording in form of YouTube recordings, and the links to Saurabh's profile or PPTs would be there. And we'll keep you posted on the topics and the date for the next session. And like Gaurav mentioned, if you're interested in being a presenter next time, please reach out to us. And we'll meet again soon.
Yeah. Yeah. And our big boss, Johan, any last words from you?
No. But thank you very much, Neha. I have to say again, Saurabh, GDPR, it was such a far away topic for me until I met you. Thanks for opening my eyes there and my heart for such an amazing topic. I think you're right. We are at the heart of GDPR. Thanks, Neha. Thank Gaurav for organizing. Let's see each other in a month again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, guys.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Have a nice weekend.